Could Meghan Markle really be under investigation by the IRS? Could a $20 million payment vanish into thin air, leaving her and Archewell exposed to scrutiny they never anticipated? Imagine the headlines. A princess, a foundation, millions in streaming deals, and now whispers of legal action that could shake the royal family to its core. What started as a story about ambition and influence has spiraled into a drama that touches money, law, and monarchy, and no one can stop asking the question. How did it get this far? The story begins not with scandal, but with vision. In the wake of stepping back from their royal duties, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry embarked on an ambitious project, Archewell. A foundation, a brand, a hope for meaningful change. They promised transparency, philanthropy, and innovation. It was more than a charity. It was a statement. A declaration that they could rewrite their destiny outside the rigid walls of monarchy. But every empire has its cracks, and every dream carries the risk of betrayal. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The first hint that all was not well came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Deals were signed. Press releases were issued. Media coverage painted a picture of a foundation rising above the noise. But behind closed doors, there were whispers. Whispers of missed payments, of obligations unfulfilled, and of negotiations that suddenly went silent. Ted Sarandos, a titan of the streaming world, was involved. The man who oversaw billions in content spending, the man who shaped Netflix into a global empire, had signed on to work with Archewell, but something went wrong. A $20 million deal, a sum that would change any organization overnight, was reportedly cut. Why? And more importantly, what did this mean for Meghan, for Archewell, and for Harry? You might be wondering, was this a simple business dispute, or something far more sinister? The truth, as it often does, lies somewhere in between. On one hand, the streaming industry is ruthless, a place where contracts are king and billions change hands with a signature. On the other, when royalty and celebrity intersect with corporate power, the stakes are amplified. Suddenly, missing millions aren't just numbers, they're narratives, headlines, and potential legal peril. And then came the IRS. The Internal Revenue Service, a name that inspires dread in accountants and billionaires alike, reportedly turned its attention to Archewell. Details are sparse, but sources hint at audits, investigations, and questions that go far beyond routine scrutiny. What triggered this level of interest? Was it just numbers on a page, or something more? A perceived mismanagement, a missing report, a charitable misstep? And could it really extend to Meghan herself? Arrest rumors have begun circulating, some fueled by leaks, some by speculation. But every rumor contains a grain of truth, and even the smallest grain can grow into a storm. Think about it. A princess, a foundation, millions in streaming revenue, and now a federal investigation. How does one even begin to navigate this? Imagine the pressure, the public scrutiny, the constant glare of cameras and headlines. Every move is watched, every statement dissected, and every rumor amplified. For someone like Meghan, who has lived in the spotlight her entire adult life, this is a different kind of challenge. One where the rules are murky, the consequences real, and the stakes monumental. The emotional toll cannot be understated. Financial uncertainty is one thing, but legal jeopardy introduces fear that cuts deeper. Anxiety, sleepless nights, pressure on family and staff, all while the world speculates about what's happening behind closed doors. It's the kind of tension that could drive anyone to breaking point. And yet, through the turmoil, Archewell continues to operate. Press releases are crafted, social media posts carefully curated, and the public sees only a polished image. But the story behind the image is far more complex, far more human, and far more explosive than anyone could imagine. And there's another twist. Ted Sarandos, the man at the center of the streaming deal, is reportedly seeking compensation himself. Imagine that. The company that agreed to pay $20 million is now fighting to reclaim or protect its own interests. The layers of conflict here are almost Shakespearean. Ambition, money, royalty, and law collide, creating a narrative that is as dramatic as it is compelling. One wrong move could reverberate across industries, across continents, and across the monarchy itself. But let's pause for a moment. Why should we care? This isn't just a story about money or celebrities. It's about the collision of power structures, corporate, legal, and royal. It's about accountability, ambition, and the fragility of even the most polished public personas. It's a cautionary tale that speaks to anyone who has ever dreamed big, negotiated hard, or faced scrutiny they weren't prepared for. And the best part? It's still unfolding. Every day brings new developments, new leaks, and new questions. By the time we unpack the details, you'll know the hidden history of Archewell, the behind-the-scenes negotiations with Netflix, the IRS's reported findings, and the personal toll on Meghan and Harry. You'll hear the stories that didn't make headlines, the contradictions between public statements and private documents, and the twists that could change the entire narrative. And if you think you know how this ends, think again, because every layer we peel back reveals something more surprising, more dramatic, and more consequential. So buckle up. In this expose, we will explore the rise of Archewell, the streaming deal that went awry, the IRS investigation that shook the foundation, and the financial and personal battles that continue to unfold. We'll question motives, dissect strategies, and reveal the hidden dynamics that could determine the future of Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and the empire they built outside the monarchy. And if you think this story is just about money, think again. Every dollar, every document, and every decision tells a story of ambition, trust, betrayal, and resilience. As we dive deeper, the narrative twists in ways few expected, and some revelations will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fame, royalty, and power. Could two people, thrust into the glare of global fame, really build something entirely their own? That was the promise of Archewell, the foundation created by Meghan Markle and Prince Harry after stepping back from royal duties. On the surface, it looked like a story of reinvention, a prince and a princess turning their notoriety into purpose, philanthropy, and influence. But as with all high-profile ventures, the closer you look, the more cracks you see. Dreams, it seems, are never quite as simple as they appear. From the beginning, Archewell was framed as a beacon of innovation. Meghan often spoke about the importance of connection, compassion, and action, words that resonated with millions of people around the world. Harry, meanwhile, emphasized service, responsibility, and a desire to do good beyond titles and traditions. Together, they presented a united front, a couple stepping away from monarchy, not to escape, but to create. It was compelling. It was marketable. It was ambitious beyond measure. Yet ambition, as anyone in business knows, comes at a price. The first whispers of trouble started quietly, almost imperceptibly. Behind the press releases and social media campaigns, sources hint that early operational structures were thin. Archewell was a foundation in name, but in practice, it required sophisticated legal, financial, and organizational frameworks. Managing millions in donations, streaming deals, and global attention is far different than managing a team of a dozen staffers. Early hires reportedly struggled to balance these demands, and small oversights began to grow. But the vision was irresistible. For Harry and Meghan, Archewell wasn't just a foundation, it was a chance to redefine legacy. They envisioned a platform for charitable work, media production, and storytelling, one that could rival traditional institutions in scope and impact. They planned partnerships with companies, nonprofits, and media outlets, positioning themselves at the intersection of influence and purpose. Yet even the most carefully laid plans can be undone when high stakes, big money, and global scrutiny collide. Consider the symbolism of the name itself. Archewell, Archie meaning source or beginning, and well, symbolizing a source of nourishment. They were branding not just a foundation, but a movement. Every logo, every press release, every carefully curated social media post was designed to reinforce this vision. And for a moment, it worked. Headlines praised them. Fans applauded. The narrative of reinvention captured imaginations around the world. But not everyone behind the scenes was so sure. Financially, Archewell was entering uncharted territory. When Harry and Meghan signed their first streaming deals, it seemed like a natural extension of their vision. Netflix, a company already adept at storytelling and high-profile productions, offered an avenue to broadcast their message globally. Yet with millions on the table came scrutiny. The challenge was no longer just building a foundation. It was balancing mission with business, ideals with contracts, and public image with private reality. The stakes were higher than they realized. And then, quietly, problems began to emerge. Contracts with media partners were complex, requiring precise reporting, deadlines, and approvals. Internal sources later described a flurry of late payments, missed milestones, and operational misalignments. In an industry where millions can hinge on a single clause, even minor errors can escalate into major disputes. The foundation's public face remained flawless, but behind the scenes, tensions simmered. Yet the pressure wasn't just operational. There was also the ever-present glare of royalty. Even in stepping away from official duties, Harry and Meghan could not escape the weight of their titles. Every move was analyzed through the lens of legacy, duty, and expectation. For them, Archewell was more than a project. It was a statement that they could carve their own path, redefine relevance, and still honor their commitment to service. But carving a new path when so many eyes are watching is never straightforward. This chapter in Archewell's history is also a human story. Staffers recall long hours, high expectations, and the intensity of managing a foundation under constant public scrutiny. There were moments of triumph. Yes, successful campaigns, viral media projects, and heartfelt philanthropic work. But these successes existed alongside frustrations, misunderstandings, and the creeping realization that this venture was more complicated than anyone anticipated. And amidst all this, the financial stakes loomed larger every day. While Archewell's public narrative focused on mission and vision, the reality of handling millions in contracts and payments introduced another layer of tension. This wasn't just about doing good. It was about balancing financial responsibility, legal obligations, and the very public perception of integrity. Every decision carried weight, and the potential for misstep was enormous. So the question arises: how does a royal couple, armed with fame, ambition, and a clear mission, navigate the complex world of high-stakes philanthropy and media business? It is a question that would become more urgent as the foundation grew, deals became larger, and scrutiny intensified. And the answers, as we will see, were not simple. They involved negotiations with global media executives, internal strategic disagreements, and ultimately, the question of trust. Who could be relied upon when millions and reputations were on the line? But just as Archewell was finding its footing, the first real storm appeared on the horizon. A $20 million deal with Netflix, initially a source of excitement and promise, began to unravel. Payments were delayed. Clauses were disputed. Ted Sarandos, the media executive overseeing the contract, reportedly began to take actions that would complicate the foundation's trajectory. The dream of reinvention was colliding head-on with the harsh realities of business and law. And it wasn't just money that was at stake. Every contract, every negotiation, carried potential consequences for public image, trust, and credibility. One misstep could ignite media frenzy, provoke royal criticism, and attract regulatory scrutiny. The couple had built something extraordinary, but the same visibility that offered opportunity now magnified every error, every disagreement, and every delay. What made this moment even more precarious was the human factor. Meghan and Harry were navigating pressures unlike any other organization. They were parents, public figures, former royals, and global celebrities all at once. Their decisions would be scrutinized not just for business effectiveness, but for ethical integrity, personal accountability, and public perception. Every conversation with advisors or media executives carried weight. Every signature on a contract had potential implications far beyond the pages of the document. And yet, despite these pressures, Archewell continued to move forward. Campaigns were launched. Partnerships were announced. Philanthropic work continued. But beneath the surface, tensions and challenges were mounting. The combination of high expectations, complex financial dealings, and unprecedented public scrutiny created a perfect storm. And that storm was only just beginning. So, as we close this chapter on the birth of Archewell, it's clear that ambition, vision, and purpose were never in short supply. The foundation represented a chance to redefine impact, challenge traditional institutions, and create a legacy outside the royal mold. But as the coming chapters will reveal, The collision of royalty, media, and finance is rarely simple, and even the most inspired vision can be threatened by human error, legal complication, and unforeseen betrayal. What happens when ambition meets corporate power? When a princess steps into the cutthroat world of global streaming? For Archewell, the answer came in the form of a $100 million deal with Netflix, a partnership that promised to amplify their message, bring their stories to millions, and cement their influence far beyond royal circles. On paper, it looked perfect. In reality, it became the spark that would ignite a financial and legal storm. The deal was announced with great fanfare. Headlines praised the couple for leveraging their platform to create content that could inspire and inform. Meghan and Harry spoke about meaningful storytelling, highlighting stories of resilience, social justice, and human connection. Netflix positioned the deal as a win-win, a globally recognized couple bringing their star power, combined with a platform hungry for premium content. Fans celebrated, critics raised eyebrows, and the world watched with curiosity. But beneath the surface, not everything was as harmonious as it seemed. Contracts of this magnitude are complex, often spanning hundreds of pages with clauses that dictate creative control, budgets, production schedules, and, most importantly, payments. Every milestone has financial consequences. Every deliverable must align with contractual terms. And as with any deal involving large sums, the devil was in the details. Ted Sarandos, Netflix's co-CEO, played a pivotal role in overseeing this deal. A media executive with decades of experience, Sarandos had negotiated billions in contracts and was no stranger to high-profile negotiations. His involvement lent credibility and weight to the project, but also introduced a dynamic that would later become contentious. Sources later revealed that communications between Netflix and Archewell were not always smooth. There were emails, memos, and meetings where deadlines were questioned, creative directions debated, and financial clauses scrutinized. Small disagreements that might have been minor in another context quickly escalated under the public eye. The first cracks began to show with the delayed payments. $20 million, reportedly earmarked for content production, did not arrive on schedule. For most organizations, delayed payments might be an inconvenience. For Archewell, operating on a tight schedule with media projects in motion, it became a source of tension and uncertainty. Staffers later described a growing sense of anxiety. Production teams were ready to begin projects, budgets had been allocated, and expectations had been set, but the funds that would make it all possible were suddenly in question. What made matters worse was the perception of public image. Every delay, every internal dispute, risked becoming a headline. For a couple already navigating intense scrutiny, the stakes were enormous. Imagine negotiating a contract worth tens of millions while millions of people watch every move, ready to amplify mistakes or missteps. The pressure was unimaginable. And as the weeks went by, whispers of tension between Netflix executives and Archewell staff began leaking into the media. Compounding the problem was the complexity of Archewell itself. The foundation was not a traditional production company. It was a hybrid entity, part charitable foundation, part media platform. This dual nature meant that negotiations had to account for both philanthropic goals and business realities, a balancing act that proved tricky. In some cases, Netflix executives reportedly struggled to reconcile Archewell's mission-driven goals with the financial and logistical requirements of producing content at scale. Conversely, Archewell's team found the corporate machinery of Netflix slow, bureaucratic, and sometimes inflexible. And then came the reports of withheld payments. $20 million, promised as part of the first tranche, was reportedly cut. Officially, Netflix cited contractual concerns and unfulfilled milestones. Internally, sources suggest the dispute centered on differing interpretations of creative deliverables, timing of releases, and financial reporting. The result? A foundation with ambitious goals suddenly facing the stark reality of corporate oversight, and a media empire accustomed to precision and accountability asserting its authority. But it wasn't just a financial or contractual dispute. There were human dynamics at play. Staffers described the tension as palpable, with long hours, high stress, and constant pressure from both sides. For Meghan and Harry, the stakes were personal. This wasn't just a business deal. It was a symbol of their post-royal identity. Every decision felt like it could define them publicly and privately. For Netflix, it was a standard corporate partnership, albeit one in the spotlight. The collision of these worlds created a volatile mix. The public narrative, meanwhile, painted a very different picture. Headlines celebrated the deal, interviews highlighted noble intentions, and social media buzzed with optimism. But inside, the reality was more complicated. A delayed payment, misaligned expectations, and a growing sense that the foundation might not be fully prepared for the operational and financial complexities of such a deal. Adding to the tension was the role of Ted Sarandos himself. Sources indicate that he grew increasingly concerned about the progress of Archewell's projects. In corporate terms, $20 million is significant, but in the public narrative, the optics of tension between a globally recognized media platform and a royal-backed foundation were explosive. According to insiders, Sarandos began exploring compensation adjustments and potential contractual safeguards, moves that would later become central to the controversy. Meanwhile, staffers at Archewell found themselves caught in the crossfire. Creative teams, project managers, and advisors struggled to balance deadlines with the realities of delayed payments and shifting expectations. Internal communications reveal frustration and uncertainty, with some staff questioning the feasibility of meeting both mission-driven goals and corporate requirements simultaneously. For a foundation built on purpose and vision, this was a sobering reality check. And as the financial dispute simmered, another layer of complexity emerged: regulatory scrutiny. While the IRS was not yet publicly involved, the structure of Archewell, a hybrid foundation with charitable and for-profit activities, made it vulnerable to questions about tax reporting, compliance, and financial accountability. What might have begun as a business dispute between a media company and a foundation suddenly had implications beyond the negotiating table. The stakes continued to escalate. $20 million wasn't just a number. It represented operational capability, credibility, and public trust. Every day that payments were delayed, every disagreement in the negotiation amplified the tension. And for Meghan and Harry, the personal stakes were immense. The foundation represented not only their post-royal mission, but also their identity, reputation, and legacy. Losing control of this narrative, or being perceived as mismanaging it, was not an option. Then came the turning point. Private communications between Netflix executives and Archewell staff reportedly revealed a breakdown in trust. Sarandos, backed by legal and financial advisors, reportedly sought compensation adjustments, raising questions about the deliverables and timing. For Archewell, this was more than a negotiation. It was a potential existential threat. If the $20 million was cut or withheld, projects could stall, reputations could be damaged, and the promise of the foundation could falter before it fully launched. As tension mounted, internal debates at Archewell intensified. How to respond without escalating public scrutiny. How to protect the foundation's mission while navigating corporate contracts. How to balance ambition with reality. These questions would dominate strategy meetings, emails, and private consultations in the weeks that followed. And for Meghan and Harry, the personal dimension added pressure that few corporate leaders experience. Every decision carried emotional weight, public visibility, and potential media fallout. And yet, even as these internal and corporate struggles unfolded, the public narrative remained polished. Media appearances highlighted noble intentions, charitable goals, and inspiring projects. The contrast between perception and reality grew starker by the day. Those watching behind the curtain could see tension, uncertainty, and the first real cracks in Archewell's ambitious vision. But what truly escalated the situation and would set the stage for the IRS investigation was not just corporate tension. It was what happened next. The missing $20 million wasn't simply a financial hiccup. According to sources, this dispute opened the door to legal and regulatory scrutiny, forcing Archewell to confront questions about compliance, reporting, and accountability. Suddenly, a streaming deal designed to amplify their mission became the first domino in a much larger, more complex crisis. And just as they began to wrestle with these challenges, whispers of IRS involvement started to circulate. Audits, investigations, and inquiries loomed on the horizon. an escalation that no one at Archewell could have predicted when the foundation first began. What was meant to be a partnership built on shared vision and global storytelling had become a flashpoint for financial scrutiny, legal tension, and reputational risk. Could the Internal Revenue Service really knock on the door of a royal-backed foundation? Could a glamorous, media-savvy organization like Archewell, with its high-profile founders and public image carefully curated for millions of followers, suddenly find itself under federal scrutiny? That is exactly what sources suggest began to happen in the wake of the Netflix deal controversy, as the IRS reportedly turned its attention toward Archewell. The IRS does not intervene lightly. Audits and investigations are typically triggered by discrepancies, inconsistencies, or red flags in financial reporting. In most cases, they target complex organizations, those with unusual income streams, or those with high-value transactions that don't align perfectly with tax filings. For Archewell, a foundation operating at the intersection of charity, media production, and global celebrity influence, the conditions were ripe for close examination. What likely drew the IRS's attention first were financial inconsistencies related to the streaming deal. Large sums, like the $20 million tranche reportedly cut by Netflix, inevitably raise questions about reporting, recognition of revenue, and timing of receipts. Was Archewell reporting these funds accurately? Were they properly categorized in tax filings? Did the foundation's dual status, part charitable entity, part production company, create a gray area that demanded clarification? These are precisely the types of questions that can trigger a full audit. Sources suggest that internal communications within Archewell began reflecting this growing tension. Emails between executives, lawyers, and accountants reportedly centered on compliance, reporting, and documentation, attempts to ensure that every dollar and every contract could withstand scrutiny. The foundation, accustomed to managing creative projects and media campaigns, suddenly found itself navigating a complex landscape of tax law, corporate oversight, and federal regulation. Imagine the pressure. You are a globally recognized public figure, building a foundation meant to inspire, inform, and affect change. You face intense media scrutiny, high expectations from your staff, and now federal auditors examining every financial decision. Every invoice, every contract, every internal memo becomes subject to analysis. The stress is immense, the stakes incredibly high, and the consequences potentially devastating. Adding to the tension was the timing. The IRS reportedly initiated preliminary inquiries around the same period that Archewell was grappling with delayed payments and disputes with Netflix. What might have otherwise been a contained corporate disagreement now became entwined with regulatory oversight. Suddenly, missing payments and contractual disputes weren't just operational issues. They could be interpreted as compliance concerns. And when federal authorities are involved, the public perception is as significant as the legal reality. For Meghan and Harry, this development represented a new and unfamiliar challenge. They had navigated media scrutiny before, but dealing with a federal agency is a different arena entirely. Auditors are not swayed by fame, influence, or celebrity status. They examine documents, track discrepancies, and demand answers backed by verifiable evidence. For Archewell, whose operations span charitable activities and content production, this meant an exhaustive review of everything from donations to expenditures, contracts to creative budgets. Reports suggest that the IRS audit quickly revealed areas of concern. Certain transactions, particularly those tied to media production and large payments, required clarification. Were expenses properly documented? Were the lines between charitable and for-profit activities appropriately drawn? Did the foundation meet all reporting requirements for income and contributions? Each of these questions carried weight, not just for compliance, but for reputation. And as the audit progressed, rumors began to circulate that investigators were scrutinizing Meghan personally. While federal agencies typically target organizations rather than individuals without cause, the fact that she is a co-founder, signatory on contracts, and a public face of the foundation placed her in the spotlight. Speculation about potential personal accountability, possible fines, or even criminal investigation began surfacing in certain media outlets, though none of these reports were officially confirmed at the time. What made the situation even more precarious was the interplay between media perception and legal reality. Audits are meant to be procedural, technical, and confidential. But with a foundation as public-facing as Archewell, no inquiry remains private for long. Leaks, rumors, and speculation amplified every perceived misstep, creating a feedback loop where public opinion could influence, or at least complicate, the legal and regulatory process. Inside Archewell, the environment reportedly grew tense. Staffers and executives scrambled to gather documentation, clarify reporting, and respond to inquiries. Meetings extended late into the night, and consultants were brought in to advise on compliance, risk mitigation, and strategic communication. For a foundation accustomed to creative projects, storytelling, and media production, this new reality was jarring. Suddenly, every spreadsheet, memo, and bank statement had to withstand rigorous scrutiny. And yet, despite the pressure, there were also moments of frustration and contradiction. Some staffers reportedly felt that auditors were misinterpreting the unique hybrid nature of Archewell, neither fully a media company nor solely a charitable foundation. What might be standard practice in a production company could appear unusual in a tax filing, and vice versa. These ambiguities created stress, internal debate, and the looming sense that even minor mistakes could have outsized consequences. While the audit was underway, the Netflix dispute remained unresolved. The timing could not have been worse. Delayed payments, withheld funds, and contractual disagreements were all now under the microscope, raising questions about revenue recognition, deliverable fulfillment, and financial responsibility. For the IRS, this combination of factors likely raised legitimate questions. For Archewell, it created a perfect storm of operational, legal, and reputational pressure. And then came the rumors, some whispered, some amplified by media outlets, that investigators were considering personal implications for Meghan. While these reports were speculative, the mere suggestion of a federal audit implicating a co-founder personally added enormous psychological and public pressure. How do you navigate scrutiny when your every decision is visible to millions, when your personal and professional life are intertwined, and when the stakes are both legal and reputational? The answer is complicated, and the consequences could be severe. It is also worth noting the emotional toll. Staffers reportedly experienced burnout, stress, and anxiety as deadlines for documentation and compliance grew urgent. Meghan and Harry, as public figures and founders, were not insulated from this strain. The combination of media pressure, corporate disputes, and regulatory oversight created an environment of constant tension. Every call, every email, every internal discussion was amplified by the knowledge that federal authorities were watching, and the world might be watching too. And as the audit continued, the story began to attract attention in broader circles. Media outlets speculated, pundits debated, and social media erupted with theories about potential wrongdoing, corporate mismanagement, and royal scandal. The combination of celebrity, financial controversy, and federal investigation made for irresistible headlines. And yet, amidst all the noise, the central questions remained unresolved. What exactly triggered the IRS audit? How serious were the findings? And what, if any, personal consequences could Meghan or Harry face? Internal sources suggest that Archewell began to take preemptive measures. Legal counsel was engaged, documentation was scrutinized, and financial advisors were consulted to ensure compliance and minimize risk. It was a high-stakes balancing act, addressing federal inquiries while managing corporate relationships, staff morale, and public perception. One misstep could jeopardize both the foundation's mission and the personal reputation of its founders. And just as Archewell was beginning to respond to the IRS's inquiries, the first hints of external pressure started to emerge. Media reports suggested that Netflix executives were growing increasingly concerned about the implications of the audit for their partnership. Legal advisors reportedly cautioned that ongoing disputes over the $20 million could intersect with regulatory concerns, raising the stakes even further. Suddenly, what began as a creative collaboration had escalated into a multi-front challenge: legal, financial, and reputational. The combination of IRS scrutiny, unresolved corporate disputes, and media pressure created an unprecedented scenario. For a foundation operating in the public eye, navigating a federal audit is stressful enough. For Archewell, it became a high-wire act where every decision, every communication, and every financial transaction was magnified. Mistakes could be costly, revelations could be explosive, and the consequences could reverberate far beyond the organization itself. And just as tensions reached a boiling point, reports began circulating of internal communications revealing that the IRS investigation could potentially involve personal liability questions for Meghan herself. Whether these were rumors, speculative journalism, or preliminary inquiries, the implication alone was enough to ignite global attention. For a foundation that had sought to redefine public perception, this development threatened to undo years of careful narrative management. $20 million. That's the figure that would haunt Archewell and define the next phase of this escalating saga. But how does a sum this large suddenly become the center of tension between a globally recognized foundation and one of the world's most powerful media executives? The answer lies with Ted Sarandos, the co-CEO of Netflix, whose financial decisions and corporate maneuvers would send shockwaves through Archewell, spark regulatory attention, and amplify scrutiny on Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. It started as a straightforward contract, or at least it appeared that way publicly. Archewell, riding the momentum of its ambitious launch, partnered with Netflix to produce content aligned with its mission. Storytelling that inspired, challenged, and educated audiences globally. The initial agreement outlined specific deliverables, budgets, and timelines. The first tranche of payments, amounting to $20 million, was earmarked for production costs, staffing, and operational support. On paper, it seemed like a clear path forward. But in practice, corporate contracts are never that simple. Ted Sarandos, known for his meticulous oversight and high-stakes approach to media deals, reportedly began to scrutinize Archewell's performance and compliance with contract terms. Internal sources suggest that Sarandos was concerned with deliverables not being met according to timelines, documentation not aligning with expectations, and milestones for creative output not being clearly demonstrated. In corporate terms, these concerns are routine. But in a high-profile partnership like this, they take on outsized significance. By mid-cycle of the project, communication between Netflix and Archewell reportedly became tense. Emails circulated detailing missed deadlines, incomplete proposals, and discrepancies between projected expenses and actual outputs. From Netflix's perspective, the $20 million investment had to align with tangible progress and verifiable deliverables. From Archewell's perspective, the foundation was executing its mission-driven content, navigating the complexities of production under public scrutiny, and balancing multiple competing priorities. The two worlds were on a collision course. Ted Sarandos, backed by legal and financial advisors, reportedly made the decision to adjust the payment structure. The $20 million, initially intended as an upfront disbursement, was withheld or cut pending compliance with specific milestones. Sources indicate that this move was framed as protecting corporate interests, ensuring accountability, and mitigating risk, but for Archewell, it felt like an existential threat. Staffers later described panic, confusion, and intense internal discussions about how to respond without jeopardizing the partnership entirely. The tension wasn't merely financial, it was strategic and psychological. For Netflix, a misalignment between payment and deliverables represented both risk and precedent. Ted Sarandos' reputation, and by extension, the company's, depended on enforcing contracts with precision. For Archewell, the withheld funds represented more than operational resources. They symbolized credibility, autonomy, and the ability to fulfill their ambitious vision. Losing that $20 million could stall projects, demoralize staff, and undermine the foundation's public narrative of competence and impact. And this is where the personal stakes enter. Meghan Markle, as a co-founder and public face of Archewell, was directly implicated in these financial maneuvers. Every contract she signed, every negotiation she engaged in, and every statement she made about the Netflix partnership could be scrutinized. Suddenly, what might have been a standard corporate negotiation became intertwined with personal accountability, public perception, and potential regulatory risk. The very figurehead of the foundation was at the center of a high-stakes financial and reputational battle. Internally, The situation sparked heated discussions. How should Archewell respond to Sarandos' maneuvers? Should they comply with additional reporting requirements, dispute the payment adjustments, or seek legal recourse? Staffers and advisors reportedly debated options late into the night, balancing mission-driven objectives against legal and financial realities. Every potential move carried risk of escalation, risk of public exposure, and risk of jeopardizing the very projects the foundation sought to launch. One source suggested that the withholding of funds triggered a domino effect. Production schedules were disrupted. Contractors and collaborators grew anxious. Internal staff morale dipped. The pressure mounted, and every email or call had heightened stakes. For a foundation built on vision and purpose, the intrusion of corporate enforcement introduced tension that had never been anticipated. Meanwhile, the public narrative remained carefully managed. Press releases, interviews, and social media content continued to highlight Archewell's mission and progress, leaving the broader audience largely unaware of the internal struggle. But for those within the organization, the story was different. High-stakes negotiations, the potential loss of $20 million, and the growing scrutiny of financial operations created an environment of constant pressure. Every decision became strategic, every conversation loaded, every document potentially critical. Ted Sarandos' financial maneuvers were not just about holding money, they were about leverage. By adjusting payments and tying them to specific milestones, he effectively forced Archewell to align with corporate expectations and demonstrate compliance. While this is standard practice in business, in this case, the high-profile nature of the partnership magnified the consequences. For Archewell, compliance wasn't just about meeting contractual obligations. It was about preserving the foundation's reputation, protecting the public image of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, and maintaining staff confidence. But the withholding of funds also had unintended consequences. It exposed Archewell to potential regulatory scrutiny. The IRS, which had already begun preliminary inquiries into the foundation, reportedly became more interested in the financial operations. Large sums of money, delayed or withheld payments, and complex contractual relationships between a foundation and a for-profit media company are precisely the kind of scenarios that trigger audits. The $20 million issue, initially a corporate negotiation, became a catalyst for federal investigation, a reality that few within Archewell could have anticipated. Staffers recalled a sense of disbelief and urgency. How could a media deal, intended to empower and amplify the foundation's mission, now become the epicenter of financial tension, regulatory scrutiny, and media speculation? Every call with Netflix executives, every email to Sarandos' team, every internal memo could carry ramifications far beyond the immediate partnership. The stakes were astronomical, both financially and reputationally. And then there were the human elements. For Meghan Markle, the stress of the situation was magnified by constant public attention. Every action, every statement, and every decision was scrutinized by fans, critics, and the press. For Harry, the stakes were personal as well. Protecting his family, safeguarding the foundation's vision, and navigating a landscape where celebrity, finance, and legal risk intersected in unpredictable ways. Together, they faced the dual challenge of managing operational crises and protecting themselves from reputational damage. Meanwhile, Netflix executives, including Sarandos, continued to maintain pressure. Milestones had to be met. Documentation had to be submitted. Compliance requirements had to be fulfilled. Every delay or discrepancy risked further withholding of funds, potential contract termination, or escalation into legal proceedings. For Archewell, the path forward required meticulous planning, strategic decision-making, and perhaps even concessions that could influence the foundation's autonomy and operations. This is where the narrative takes a dramatic turn. The withholding of $20 million was more than a financial maneuver. It was a catalyst that would expose Archewell to vulnerabilities they had not fully anticipated. It opened the door for regulatory scrutiny, intensified media speculation, and set in motion a chain of events that would challenge the foundation at every level: operational, financial, legal, and personal. And just as Archewell was grappling with these pressures, reports began to emerge suggesting that Sarandos' actions might also influence the foundation's future compensation strategies. internal hierarchy, and project approvals. The decisions made in these corporate negotiations had ramifications that extended far beyond the $20 million, touching on long-term sustainability, public perception, and the very mission of the foundation itself. When $20 million disappears, or is withheld, it is rarely just a financial issue. For Archewell, the withholding of funds by Netflix under Ted Sarandos' oversight triggered far-reaching consequences that went well beyond dollars and cents. It became a catalyst for legal maneuvers, internal upheaval, and strategic recalibration. What began as a corporate dispute rapidly transformed into a battle over credibility, operational control, and public perception. The first step for Archewell was internal triage. According to sources, Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and the foundation's senior leadership immediately convened a series of urgent meetings with legal counsel. Lawyers specializing in entertainment contracts, nonprofit law, and corporate governance were consulted to map out the foundation's options. Every clause of the Netflix contract was scrutinized line by line, every payment schedule cross-checked against deliverables, and every internal document reviewed for accuracy. The pressure was relentless. Staffers reported a sense of controlled chaos, while the public saw polished announcements and carefully curated messaging. The internal reality was intense. Multiple teams worked around the clock to ensure that documentation met both legal standards and corporate expectations. Lawyers drafted letters, reviewed prior communications, and prepared for potential litigation. The foundation's operational and creative staff were simultaneously tasked with ensuring ongoing projects did not stall, even as the $20 million that fueled them remained in limbo. Public perception was another major concern. Archewell had carefully cultivated an image of transparency, purpose, and impact. A public dispute with Netflix risked undermining that image, especially if it became known that payments were being withheld and legal battles were looming. Every public statement, social media post, and media interview had to be meticulously coordinated to convey confidence without revealing the mounting tension behind closed doors. One misstep could trigger a narrative of mismanagement, incompetence, or internal dysfunction, headlines that could have long-lasting repercussions for the foundation and its founders. The legal strategy adopted by Archewell reportedly focused on three key fronts: compliance documentation, negotiation leverage, and media management. First, the foundation sought to demonstrate that it had met, or was in the process of meeting, all contractual obligations to Netflix. Every email, memo, production schedule, and financial statement became critical evidence. Legal teams worked tirelessly to ensure that these documents could withstand scrutiny, not only from Netflix, but also from any regulators who might be observing the financial flows. Second, Archewell sought to negotiate leverage. With Sarandos holding the cards on the $20 million, the foundation needed to create conditions that would protect its operational stability while maintaining goodwill, or at least neutrality, with Netflix. This involved drafting counterproposals, requesting clarifications on milestones, and proposing alternative reporting mechanisms that would satisfy contractual requirements without undermining the foundation's creative autonomy. It was a delicate balancing act: push too hard and risk escalating the dispute, push too softly and risk being financially stranded. The third front was media management. Legal battles rarely remain private when celebrity figures are involved. For Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, the media attention was both a risk and a tool. Carefully worded public statements could signal confidence, transparency, and responsibility, while leaks or offhand comments could be misconstrued, amplifying criticism or speculation. Legal counsel reportedly collaborated closely with public relations teams to ensure every statement reinforced Archewell's narrative of professionalism and mission-driven purpose, even as the financial stakes climbed. Complicating matters further was the broader landscape of scrutiny surrounding Archewell. The IRS had reportedly begun reviewing the foundation's financial operations, and questions about compliance and reporting added an additional layer of pressure. Any legal action with Netflix could be interpreted through the lens of regulatory oversight, amplifying concerns about transparency, accountability, and fiduciary responsibility. For the founders, the situation was a triple threat: corporate, legal, and regulatory. Internal dynamics also came under strain. Staffers and leadership teams had to navigate competing priorities. On one hand, they had to maintain operations, ensure that content production continued, and preserve staff morale. On the other, they had to meet increasingly stringent legal requirements, manage the flow of information to Netflix, and coordinate with lawyers. Tensions reportedly ran high, with debates over strategy, priorities, and next steps occurring daily. Fatigue, frustration, and pressure to perform created an atmosphere of intense scrutiny, even within the walls of the foundation. Meanwhile, the public narrative of Archewell's work continued. Projects were announced, press releases went out, and interviews highlighted the foundation's mission-driven initiatives. Yet, behind the polished image, the legal battles simmered. The contrast between public perception and internal reality became a point of concern. Every public success had to be weighed against the potential impact of the legal dispute, and every delay or miscommunication risked being amplified in the media or, worse, used as evidence in contractual negotiations. Negotiations with Netflix reportedly involved multiple rounds of correspondence, detailed financial breakdowns, and extensive legal arguments. Sarandos' team, intent on protecting Netflix's interests, maintained a firm position on the withheld funds. Archewell, seeking to secure operational stability and safeguard the Foundation's mission, had to craft responses that were precise, legally defensible, and publicly palatable. According to insiders, this phase of the dispute was both exhausting and delicate. One misstep could jeopardize millions in funding, project timelines, and the Foundation's credibility. As the legal battle unfolded, the implications for Meghan Markle became increasingly pronounced. As a co-founder and public figurehead, her reputation was directly tied to the outcome of these negotiations. Reports suggest that advisors counseled her on every public statement, legal submission, and internal memo to minimize personal exposure. For Harry, the stakes were equally high: protecting his spouse, maintaining organizational integrity, and ensuring that Archewell's broader mission was not compromised by the financial and legal turbulence. The human cost of the dispute cannot be understated. Staffers working long hours, legal teams navigating complex contract clauses, and founders balancing public image with operational responsibility faced constant stress. The pressure was compounded by the awareness that the dispute was unfolding in a hyperpublic arena. Every document, every statement, and every internal decision could potentially be exposed to scrutiny, criticism, or misinterpretation. But even amid the tension, Archewell's legal team reportedly pursued innovative strategies. They explored alternative payment structures, proposed phased release of funds contingent on verified milestones, and sought to clarify ambiguous contractual language. The goal was to protect the Foundation's operations, secure the funds necessary to fulfill its mission, and preserve the working relationship with Netflix, even under highly strained circumstances. And yet, the dispute could not be contained. As negotiations intensified, leaks and speculation began to appear in the media. Headlines hinted at financial mismanagement, questioned the integrity of the Foundation, and raised the possibility of further legal complications. For Meghan and Harry, the convergence of corporate, legal, and media pressures created a perfect storm, one that tested not only their leadership and strategic skills, but also their resilience under global scrutiny. This legal battle, while rooted in a financial dispute, had far-reaching consequences. It exposed vulnerabilities in the Foundation's operational structure, amplified scrutiny from regulators, and placed unprecedented pressure on its founders. The stakes were no longer just about completing projects or telling meaningful stories. They were about survival, credibility, and the future of Archewell itself. And just as the Foundation began to navigate these legal hurdles, whispers started circulating that the situation could escalate beyond corporate negotiations. Early signs suggested that regulatory bodies were now paying closer attention, potentially linking the Netflix dispute to broader questions about financial reporting, compliance, and accountability. What began as a corporate spat over $20 million was evolving into a multi-front crisis, one that could threaten the very foundation of Archewell and put Meghan Markle squarely in the spotlight of legal and regulatory attention. Could it really be true? Could Meghan Markle, a global public figure and former royal, be facing the possibility of federal arrest? When whispers of IRS involvement first surfaced, the media and public were quick to speculate. Headlines splashed with questions, rumors proliferated on social media, and debates raged over whether a celebrity of her stature could truly be subject to the same legal scrutiny as any other citizen. But what was fact and what was fiction? It's important to understand how the IRS operates. Federal audits, investigations, and enforcement actions are highly regulated processes. While the agency has broad powers to investigate potential violations of tax law, it is constrained by procedure, evidence requirements, and legal protocols. Arrests are exceedingly rare and typically reserved for cases involving clear evidence of fraud, evasion, or deliberate noncompliance. For a high-profile foundation like Archewell, the mere possibility of an IRS arrest raises questions about what triggered such rumors, and how quickly speculation can become perceived fact in the age of 24/7 news cycles. The genesis of these rumors appears tied to the timing of Archewell's financial disputes and the publicized Netflix deal. With the $20 million tranche withheld, questions about revenue recognition, deliverables, and compliance arose. Federal auditors, reviewing these transactions, would naturally probe deeper into the foundation's finances, seeking clarity and documentation. To outsiders watching the unfolding saga, an audit can easily morph into a narrative of wrongdoing, even if investigators are simply performing standard review procedures. Within media circles, speculation intensified. Some reports suggested that the IRS was considering personal liability for Meghan due to her co-founding role and public association with Archewell. Others hinted that audits could escalate to formal investigations or even legal enforcement actions. Social media amplified these rumors exponentially, blending conjecture with partial information and creating a perception that Meghan was personally at risk of arrest. Insiders from Archewell reportedly viewed these rumors with a mix of frustration and concern. On one hand, the IRS audit was procedural, a necessary compliance measure, not a criminal investigation. On the other, the public perception of a royal being potentially arrested created intense pressure. Every public appearance, every media interview, and every social media post had to be carefully managed to maintain credibility and mitigate panic, both internally among staff and externally among supporters. Legal counsel for the foundation emphasized the distinction between audit and arrest. Audits are investigative. They require documentation, clarification, and responses to inquiries. Arrests, by contrast, involve criminal charges, indictments, and judicial oversight. In other words, while the rumors made for sensational headlines, the actual procedures in play were far more mundane, but no less stressful for those involved. Still, the psychological and strategic implications were significant. For Meghan, the personal pressure was immense. She had navigated media scrutiny before, but dealing with the implication of potential federal action, regardless of its factual accuracy, was a new challenge. For Harry, the stakes were equally personal. Protecting his spouse, shielding staff, and maintaining the foundation's operations amid the swirling rumors. The couple had to act decisively, both to comply with regulatory requirements and to manage the narrative that threatened to spiral out of control. Complicating matters was the fact that high-profile audits often attract additional media attention, not only for the individuals involved, but for the organization as a whole. Archewell's hybrid structure. A foundation engaged in both charitable work and media production created ambiguities that could appear suspicious to casual observers. Every delayed payment, every unresolved milestone, and every contractual nuance became fodder for speculation. The IRS audit, which might otherwise have remained confidential, became entwined with public narrative, intensifying the perceived risk. Sources suggest that Archewell responded with a multi-pronged strategy. First, the foundation's legal team ensured that all documentation, contracts, and communications were meticulously organized and submitted in compliance with federal requests. Second, internal communication protocols were strengthened, emphasizing accuracy and confidentiality to prevent leaks or misunderstandings. Third, public relations strategies were deployed to manage perception, reaffirming the foundation's commitment to transparency, compliance, and ethical operation. The legal and media dynamics created a unique challenge. In a typical corporate audit, internal teams work quietly with regulators and legal counsel, often without public notice. For Archewell, the presence of a celebrity co-founder turned every procedural step into potential headline material. The distinction between routine audit procedures and high-profile personal scrutiny blurred in the public eye, fueling speculation about possible criminal action. Social media amplified the tension exponentially. Hashtags, theories, and viral posts spread the idea that Meghan could face arrest. Each post added pressure. Each article shaped perception, and each rumor created uncertainty for both the public and those working within Archewell. Staffers reportedly spent hours addressing inquiries, drafting clarifications, and managing the narrative, all while continuing to operate ongoing projects and manage internal responsibilities. Legal experts consulted by the foundation emphasized that the likelihood of an arrest was extremely low unless there was evidence of deliberate fraud or criminal evasion. Yet even this rational perspective did little to quell public speculation or internal anxiety. The narrative had already taken on a life of its own, illustrating how perception, rumor, and media amplification can magnify legal processes into near-crisis situations. The rumors also had operational consequences. Board members, advisors, and contractors became anxious about potential exposure or liability. Project timelines were reviewed with increased scrutiny. Even routine financial decisions were slowed by concern that missteps could be interpreted as evidence of wrongdoing. What began as speculation had tangible effects on the foundation's functioning, staff morale, and public confidence. And as the audit continued, Archewell faced the challenge of ensuring that its responses satisfied regulatory authorities while simultaneously controlling media narrative. This required meticulous documentation, careful communication, and strategic framing. Every email, memo, and public statement had to strike a balance between transparency and discretion, revealing enough to comply with requirements, but not so much as to fuel speculation or provide new angles for sensationalist reporting. The intersection of legal process and public perception was uniquely intense for Archewell. Unlike most organizations under IRS review, the foundation operated in the global spotlight, with millions invested in its public image. The stakes were no longer just